Good evening and welcome to Face to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh Chaliathambi. I am delighted to welcome to our studio Christine Arab, who is the UN Women Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, and also the UN Women Representative to the Kingdom of Thailand. Good evening and welcome, Christine.
Good evening, Naresh. Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome. So you are making your third visit to Sri Lanka.
Yes.
Lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
And you've been meeting with various government officials and, of course, looking at all the work that UN Women as an agency has done in Sri Lanka. And just to kick things off, could I ask you to explain to our audience about the work of UN Women in the Asia-Pacific region, which is your region?
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you, Naresh, for having us. UN Women has three areas, three ways in which we work. First, we support the 193 governments that make up the UN in setting the global standards and norms on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Then at the country levels, we support governments and civil society in giving legs to those commitments through national legislation and through services on the ground. And we also, within the UN system, which is huge, as you know, we have a responsibility under the UN resident coordinator in countries to support coordination and increased investment by the UN on gender equality, which in a country like Sri Lanka, which clearly tables the importance of gender equality in the government, the UN as a system prioritizes the issue. UN Women's work is very focused on women's leadership in public and private sector, women's leadership, voice, and engagement in peace and security, humanitarian and disaster risk response and reduction, women's economic livelihoods, and ending gender-based violence. Across Asia and the Pacific, unfortunately, one of the very common themes is how much a climate-related disaster impacts all of those areas that I just mentioned. So that permeates much of what we do, but also how much cyber insecurity and tech-facilitated violence against women, how dramatically it is increasing across Asia and the Pacific. And that is actually something we see mirrored across the world right now, unfortunately. That's the nature of our work. We work with the central and local government authorities. We work very closely with women's civil society and with private companies. We will be the game changer in the world for women, is private companies' response to gender equality.
Right. So that's a massive area. And of course, rightfully so, because it is more than 50% or about 50% of the population of the planet. Now, what are your impressions of your mission in Sri Lanka?
You know, as you say, it's my third time being in Sri Lanka over the last 15 years. An incredible trajectory of gains when it comes to women's parity in education. It's exceeding that of the South Asia regional average. Women's health, maternal mortality, there's been just incredibly impressive gains. Also, it is a country where you can talk about the fact that women from different groups, women with different abilities, religions, backgrounds, rural versus urban, it is a country that allows for those discussions of how women of those groups experience these challenges and gains differently. And that is a very welcome aspect in the region. We need more countries in the region to have that understanding of what we say in the UN is intersectionality. It's so important that in Sri Lanka that is a common dialogue. That's not common across the region.
Well, that's good to hear. From the perspective of UN Women, how would you address or assess progress on gender equality, both within the Asia-Pacific region and how does it compare here in Sri Lanka?
So there's been a lot of gains in the Asia-Pacific region. As you rightly say, Nourish, it's a massive region from Western Asia, South Asia, Southeast and East Asia, all the way down to the Pacific. Where we see the common gains is women and girls' education at all levels has significantly increased. Legal protections entrenched in constitutions or national legislation have significantly increased. Women's and girls' access to health and the key health indicators of maternal mortality, fertility rates, they're moving along at a good pace. And Sri Lanka mirrors that progress that we see. We are seeing some movement overall in women's political participation across the region, but not nearly equal to the labor force that has been put forward. You have highly capable women that should be permeating the political and private sector leaderships at a much higher level.
So in which area specifically would you like to see Sri Lanka making more gains, and which areas have we really made some progress?
I think the fact that Sri Lanka, you went from having a little above 5% of women in parliament to now just a little below 10%, that it's still a low number, but it's an impressive gain in a relatively short period.
But it's a very low number.
It is a low number. Unfortunately, this is a statistic that binds Asia and the Pacific together as relatively low numbers of women in politics. And that is directly linked to what we call social norms. And social norms are the expectations that communities and societies have laid out of boys and girls, women and men. What is an appropriate job for a woman, an appropriate job for a man? What interests a boy should have? What interests a girl should have? And in that model, there is a perpetual understanding that strength and power comes from men, not women. And that, of course, is not true. And Sri Lanka has many powerful female leaders out there. An area that unfortunately continues to be an issue is labor force participation. There have been important strides, and in Asia and the Pacific, never before in the history of the region have women been so educated and have the importance of their contributions to economy been so well understood. Having said that, the regional labor force participation rate is stagnant. And in part, that is because of South and some parts of Southeast Asia, low movement of labor force participation growth overall for women and men, but also a fast-growing population. In Sri Lanka, for example, women's labor force participation is at 33%. And that is, again, not tied to education. They're very well educated. It's linked to expectations of the jobs women should have and what we call the care economy, Naresh, the fact that women still predominantly take care of elderly and children and the household. And it is, we often will say that globally, if a woman has one child, she can both stay in the workforce and advance, even if she doesn't have support to the care work. If the woman has two children, she can stay in the workforce, but maybe not advance if she doesn't have support for the care. If she has three children, there's a good chance she will leave the place of work if she doesn't have support to care. So recruitment of women is not so much the issue as retention, because of the challenge women face in balancing out what is happening in the home and in public life.
So in that respect, where does the answer lie? Is it in more legislation or the state intervening in providing care services for young children, especially when mothers are working? Or is it a cultural shift?
I would say it's both. Some of the best cases and the best examples of a robust care economy, the care economy, it's a double-edged sword. It both is a high employer of women, all of what encompasses the care economy, women would have a strong employment ratio within that. But it is the reason why women do and do not enter or stay in the workforce. So it's certainly Sri Lanka, the fact that the government is prioritizing, they've established a roadmap to establish a care national action plan, that's crucial. That's a clear recognition that they see this as an economic driver, that the care economy has to be addressed. It fundamentally, to address it, we have to recognize two things. It's both childcare and elderly care. We have extended families across Asia and the Pacific, and the responsibility for caring for the elderly is often placed on women and girls. If you're dealing with people living with disabilities, chronic illnesses, and women in rural areas, it's even more compounded. However, you cannot advance the care economy without a robust public-private partnership. At the end of the day, it's about private sector incentivizing and being incentivized. So family-friendly policies in the workplace. There's a reason why so many women veer towards public sector work, because it tends to have entrenched good protection, but also good family-friendly policies, the time of day, etc. That needs to be taken on by private sector. And we work globally with over 11,000 private sector companies around what we call the women's empowerment principles. And in Asia alone, we're over 3,000 of those. And that is helping those private companies adopt certain policies that will both recruit, retain, and advance women. And family-friendly policies is crucial in that. But we can't forget that it has to be, it's a public good, but it needs the private sector's investment, and the private sector needs incentives to invest.
Right. Now, you spoke of the progress that Sri Lanka has made in the area of gender, but what more do we need to do to speed up this process?
I think, one of the key areas that Sri Lanka is doing well on is women, peace, and security. There is a national action plan, and UN Women has been a big partner in getting that in. And peace and security, the women, peace, and security agenda is very much about looking at communities and how communities are treating with inequalities of women and men, boys and girls, different groups, but also within that, ensuring that women and men have equal voice through different means. And that is what we would call helping communities find through their own social norms and their own behaviors a good area for women and men to have a more equal voice. It's never about bringing an outside idea in. I've met, since I've been here, with a number of civil society organizations who've been doing this for generations in Sri Lanka. And what they are saying is that the communities want to see men and women share the roles in the homes more, because they recognize that we need two economies, two jobs in a family. An average family requires that, and that means taking on shared roles. That is crucial. Also, what's crucial is women are well educated. It's about opportunity. Women need the opportunity. What has changed in the last 30 years, Naresh, is there is an increased understanding in the world and in the region and in Sri Lanka that advancing women isn't about putting a woman over a man or a girl over a boy. It's not about the sacrifice of one over the other. It's if you want to attain the goals you've set for your family or your community, you have to advance both. It is not a soft issue. It is a fundamental economic driver. I think there is no question in Sri Lanka, and we're seeing this across the region, although there's sub-regional distinctions, closing the digital divide. This is crucial.
Absolutely.
And we can't forget that the digital divide, AI, everything that is so wonderful and the opportunities that has come from the internet and artificial intelligence, it is still simply a tool of the ecosystem we live in. And that ecosystem is fundamentally unequal towards women and men. And that has not changed. Despite the rhetoric in the world, the statistics show that it is still fundamentally unequal towards women. And we really run a risk here if we don't recognize that certain communities are not equally accessing the internet, don't have that literacy. Then the economic growth models that are being put forward by any of the countries in the region, they'll fail. or they will simply further entrench the inequalities that we see. But we're also seeing that digital opportunity, and it's immense and wonderful, especially in Asia. It comes with risks. And these risks, increasingly, governments are learning that they have to legislate hate speech. They have to legislate cybersecurity with a view of protecting individuals as opposed to anything else. They have to legislate tech-facilitated violence. The first thing you will hear from any woman human rights defender in Asia is the incredible spike in tech-facilitated violence against women in public life and individual girls and women. But children overall are struggling with the insecurities that come with the internet. I want to say that we have a great example, a best case, but we don't worldwide right now. Most of the governments are on the back foot. But this is both a driver of change, but it's a risk. I think the other thing to flag, which is crucial, and as I said, it links Asia and the Pacific, is the prevalence of climate-related disaster.
Right.
And you must see in Sri Lanka that it feels at times the same communities every year are treating with the drought and then the flooding and then the landslides. And that, again, perpetuates the embedded inequalities that women and men face.
Absolutely.
It really does. And I think getting the legislation in place, you have a good Prevention of Domestic Violence Act in Sri Lanka. But there are still steps to be taken to strengthen that act so that it's survivor-centered. It enhances the coordination among the justice sector, police, but it allows for protection orders and survivor mechanisms as well.
Absolutely. But I think overall, judiciary is being strengthened, over the last year or so, and it will continue to be so. But do you see a lot more to be done in legislation and the judiciary in order to better protect women?
We do see in legislation the inequalities that women face. They either have to be legislated to address them, or the institutions have to have a shift. So when you look at the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act, there are clear recommendations on the changes to be made, and we certainly hear from the side of the government an interest in advancing that. So as I say, that when it comes to accessing justice, an average person seldom intersects with police or courts in any country. So the mechanisms need to be in place that certainly when a woman has faced abuse, when she actually goes to the authorities for redress, it's usually representing many, many cases of violence. And it's the last case that she's experienced that she's taking. So you're talking years of domestic abuse before she will go outside of the family. And we do see that the legislation needs to be tightened. There's no question right now when it comes to certain aspects of personal status legislation, family legislation, that in the case of women's rights in inheritance, women's rights in divorce, in marriage, the loop needs to be closed on the national legislation on this. And as you say, the strengthening of the judicial system to address these in a way that is effective. We are also seeing an encouraging shift within the judiciary on a lot of these issues too, which is important.
Right. We need to go for a short commercial break right now. I'm speaking with Christine Arab, who is the UN Women's Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this.
මගක් හදන විට ජීවිත දහසක් ඉදිරියට යයි. ගම්මැද්ද රට නගන ජනපෞර.
Newsfirst අවුරුදු මෙවර කළුතර බූම්බුවල විලියම් ගොඩල්ලවත්ත ක්‍රීඩාංගණයේදී පාපැති තරග ගමහරහා දිවීම කොට්ට පොර ජනකී ගායනය අවුරුදු කුමරා කුමරිය ඇතුළු ජන ක්‍රීඩා රසක් සමග කළුගම් පුරවර සිරි අවුරුදු උළෙල අප්‍රේල් 18 වෙනිදා දවස පුරා සංවිධානය කළුතර දිස්ත්‍රික් ලේකම් කාර්යාලය ඇතුළු රාජ්‍ය ආයතන සමග සමනල ක්‍රීඩා සමාජය
ළඟදිම අපට එක ඊතලින් කුරුළු දෙන්නෙන් මරා ගන්න පුළුවන්. ඔයා දන්නවද? බේස්මන්ට් එකට යන ලිෆ්ට් එකේ සීක්‍රට් බටන් එක ඕපන් කරලා තිබ්බ කියලා.
ඔයා මගේ ආදරෙත් එක්ක සෙල්ලම් කරාද? මං ඔයාට මෙච්චර ආදරය කරද්දි ඔයා කරලා තියෙන
ටයිම් පාස් කරපේ.
අද රාත්‍රී 9:30ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්
ඒ මිනිහත් එක්ක මුහුද මැද්දට ගිහලා ඊට පස්සේ තව බෝට්ටුවකට නැග්ගලු. ඉතින් කොහෙද ගියේ කියලා දන්නේ නැහැ. උනාට ඉන්දියාවට ගියා කියලා තමයි සැක කරන්නේ.
මම මොකාටද එන්න හදන්නේ බ්‍රෝ? මේක උඹේ තව ඩ්‍රාමා එකක්ද?
සදේව් මැනිකේ අයියාවා.
ඌ කොහමත් හිතේ අමාරුයි. ඌ හිතාද නම් කොටර වෙලා ඇංගිලා ඇති. ටික දවසෙන් එළියට එයි.
Don't be lazy. Have lot of work to do.
අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්
Paving paths and changing destinies. Gammata. For the people. By the people.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Christine Arab, who is the Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific at UN Women. And I think you have over half the world's population in your region, from West Asia all the way to the Pacific Islands, so including, I think, China and India. So that is huge. And so it's very important when we discuss what's going on in your region. It's what's going on in the world, isn't it?
It is.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the internet. You referred to that earlier, and this is an area which is relatively new, but you see all the old issues, the generational issues that women have faced, exploding on the internet. And like you said, governments are on the back foot. Do you think there is a certain reluctance or a lack of focus on the part of not just governments, but private sector as well? Because it is the private sector which is driving the growth of the internet.
You know, I think you could pick any social inclusion issue right now, and a lot is going to eventually trot back to the internet and what technology has brought us. Initially, governments around the world, when they were treating with the internet and the companies in the internet, it was about monopolies. It's about, protecting private sector. It was about preventing monopolies within that. Every government in Asia that we work with, including Sri Lanka, wants to treat with tech-facilitated gender-based violence. The complexity of it, Naresh, is huge. One, social platforms are not often owned within the borders of a country. So there has to be a pre-existing relationship between the regulatory bodies, for example, and the private companies that own the different social media platforms where a lot of this happens. So we have worked around cases where the abuse of a politician, the trolling of her family, the threats against her are actually not happening in a platform held in her country, but in another country. So the policing of this requires a lot of measures in place. And across Asia and the Pacific, and as you rightly said, that we are moving at the same pace as the rest of the world. And in fact, when it comes to technology, the crucial role Asia plays. So we're actually sometimes ahead of the curve. It requires I hate to use the term, but multi-stakeholder partnership across multiple borders. What we are seeing increasingly is, one, schools across the region are very aware that they play a key role in educating both the students, but also the parents. But also the teachers need to be educated. I mean, I come from a generation that is constantly on the back foot when it comes to AI and learning this. We also are seeing that tech-facilitated gender-based violence doesn't just stay online. And I wouldn't say just. It's incredibly damaging, tech-facilitated gender-based violence. It takes all forms and it tackles women and girls of all ages and boys. So it has to be treated with, but often tech-facilitated violence translates into physical violence, in-person violence. So we are seeing more and more women's organizations trying to advise on how women can keep themselves safe, cybersecurity. We work a lot on women, peace, and security across Asia and the Pacific. And cybersecurity, which isn't an aspect of that, is tech-facilitated gender-based violence. But cybersecurity overall, as you know, is crucial for the governments of Asia and the Pacific. What we are seeing, the statistics are showing us in certain parts of Asia that women's human rights defenders, for example, they're more targeted through cyber attacks. We're seeing that women-led and women-focused NGOs have more cyber attacks than non-women-led or non-gender-focused NGOs in certain parts of the region. What we are hearing, the first request I get with almost every government I meet is how we can help the governments deal with, prevent the violence from happening, and then how to prevent it, and then how to address it. And it's very frank discussions, including in Sri Lanka, about the challenges. And as I've said, there's not many governments on the planet who have done it comprehensively well, because it is such a moving target. Artificial intelligence for UN Women, this is a wonderful opportunity for women's economic empowerment and livelihoods. A rural woman wanting to sell goods without having to leave her community and to deal with all of the mobility issues that can come with that. It's incredible opportunities. And we're seeing in East Asia some fantastic apps coming out that help women in the agribusiness do more, out of China, for example. Brilliant stuff. And that's fantastic. However, as I said, if you don't have connectivity in all the communities, then that artificial intelligence can only help a certain group. But the artificial intelligence, at the end of the day, it's our tool. And it is, in many instances, the algorithms are simply replicating the gender stereotypes that the community has. The information that our children get when they use the different AI in their schooling, it will package the existing statements and opinions. And the last thing I would flag in all of that is the manosphere. It's much talked about. It's not very well understood. The manosphere encompasses everything from the most extreme misogynistic social media influencers that you hear about globally. But at the other end, it is a genuine space where a lot of young men and boys are trying to answer very real questions for young people. You know, when am I going to leave home? Will my education actually result in a job? And that part is increasingly being owned by various extreme groups. So young men will go into those spaces with good intent to understand really genuine issues they're treating with. And then they end up going down a rabbit hole that can end in very misogynistic. I won't use the word traditional. I was born in the 70s. I never saw any of what they're describing, these influencers, and they are 20 years younger than I am. So I don't know what culture they come from, because it certainly doesn't represent what I saw growing up in the 70s and 80s. And that speaks to a need of not leaving boys behind.
Right.
That is crucial, that we have boys and girls coming together on these issues so that this cannot be instrumentalized by extremist groups that wish to do so.
Definitely. And when it comes to extremism, it's all the same, isn't it? Any type of extreme group is, it needs to be reined in.
Yes.
Otherwise, it will cause a lot of destruction. whether it's targeted towards boys or women or some other group or just society in general. Now, getting back to Sri Lanka, you mentioned education and health as well. And in Sri Lanka, we have many more university graduates who are women than men. And I think that rate is growing very much. But at the same time, we don't see this reflected in leadership roles in the economy, in politics, and so on. Notwithstanding the fact that we have a woman prime minister now, but when you look at the rest of the positions, you look at cabinet, the deputy ministers, parliament, and on down the line. And then when you look at corporate boardrooms as well, the same goes. Why is that? What are we doing wrong? Why is it that we don't have more women in those roles?
No, it's an excellent point, and it's a challenge across South Asia, where you have such a robust parity at all levels of education between boys and girls, to the point where we run the risk of some boys at the tertiary level being left behind. If you go into many university classes right now, you are going to see a prevalence of young women, which is great. It's a few, education provides the skills. It doesn't necessarily open up the opportunities. The opportunities require institutional change. And sometimes that requires temporary special measures, incentivizing, getting companies to change the way they recruit. One of the first barriers a young woman can face entering the job market is if she's got a new wedding ring on her finger, the fear that she's going to have children, and therefore there's going to be paid maternity leave. That is a very real reality across Asia and the Pacific, across the world. There's also the social norm that will often have women working in Sri Lanka in industries or sectors that are typically informal. So you don't have that paid protection that is needed. Public jobs are not growing in the planet. No government is expanding the number of public sector work. So it really is about getting young women into private sector. I think less than 1% of the labor force in Sri Lanka is women employers. So women-owned businesses are a key driver of change, especially when you get into communities and in the rural areas where maybe the job market and the education market don't match, which is, I think, a global challenge right now, is how do the education that women more traditionally get, is it matching with the actual job market on the ground? And then within that, is it acceptable for her to leave her community to go take a job in STEM? Now, what we see across Asia is fantastic opportunities in STEM. And private sector sometimes willing to hire more young women, but their traditions have prevented them from actually getting into the right educational stream. And STEM is where so much of the growth that we see is happening. I think recognizing that you need more women leaders in the private sector in Sri Lanka. You need more women leaders in the public sector in Sri Lanka advancing. If you're a young boy or a young girl and you're looking around you, you need to see the role models. And Absolutely. You have them. You have them in spades. Sri Lanka's women's movement is one of the backbones of the Asia women's movement. Is 40, 50 years old, and it has been incredibly influential. Despite the fact that Sri Lanka is a relatively small country, the power of the women's movement in this country globally has been significant. You have a number of women leaders. The Prime Minister is such a well-respected woman leader across the region. And you have a president who's talking about the importance of this. So role models are crucial. And again, I go back to the point that if you go into many communities in Sri Lanka right now, and you have that frank conversation with women and men, girls and boys, you will see that interest in having women and girls do more differently. But families understandably want to know that this will be safe, that the girls won't be judged, that their family life won't be hurt. And this is always the crux. Many most Sri Lankans, I'm sure, want to make sure that their girls and boys are equally well educated. But the idea that a family structure might shift because that education translates into jobs, that's usually where we can find significant challenge in Sri Lanka, but globally right now.
Right. Now, let's talk about 2022 in Sri Lanka, the economic meltdown. This affected the entire population, of course, but women perhaps more so. And I know that there have been studies done on this. Would you like to comment on what happened and the impact on women back in 2022 and since then?
You know, the impact, first there was COVID, then 2022. So we did see the overall labor force participation rate in Sri Lanka for women reduce. I think it went from 34.5% in 2019 to 31% by 2023. They were in the sectors often informal that were some of the hardest hit, with no protection and no rights within that. But there was also the expectation that because the family had a greater burden in terms of cost of living, that women had to take on a greater role within the family, and or the child care it wasn't worth the money, given that they were barely making enough to pay for that. And this has been a very real reality. The stagnation of the women's labor force participation rate in Sri Lanka is one of the top priorities. That and comprehensively addressing gender-based violence. These remain the top two priorities. But you have to do that with the whole ecosystem. We said earlier how well educated Sri Lankan women are, but then there needs to be more rigorous engagement with private sector. But also in the different communities who experience the economic impact differently. And that we cannot ignore. Women need to be given special consideration there. UN Women, in close partnership with the Government of Australia, for example, we have a large program that works on women-owned businesses and women as entrepreneurs across all of the communities that are some of the hardest hit in 2002. We also treat within that, that evolution of social norms, how the communities are changing. Naresh, one of the biggest challenges you face when you treat with gender equality is assumptions. Every single person that you talk to has an opinion about gender equality because we've all experienced it. And we base what we consider to be real based on our own individual experiences. And that is why having sex desegregated data is so important. So to avoid assumptions, so that you can drill down as a decision maker, why is this sector growing and this sector not? Why is the labor force stagnating when you have economic growth? And that question, why is labor force stagnating when you have economic growth, is something that all of Asia and the Pacific is grappling with, all governments are. But if you don't have gender desegregated data, it's very difficult to understand where the bottlenecks are.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned climate-related issues which impact women. And in Sri Lanka, we had a first-hand and rather terrible experience in this with Cyclone Ditwa last year in November and December. And we are still recovering from that. How do you view the framework of disaster recovery, policies and processes, emergency response? How do you see gender, the need for gender to be included in this?
We come at it from, I would say, four main ways. First, when disaster has struck, women dominate in fisheries, plantation, agriculture, just to name a few. In Sri Lanka, these, of course, can suffer first and foremost when the cyclone struck a few months ago. Also, what you see is often not always, and that of course was different with Cyclone Ditwa, is the same communities tend to have the annual floods, the annual droughts, the mudslides that can come with the floods. That just compounds some inequalities. When you have a climate-related disaster, women are often immediately impacted more than men, only because the family as a whole is impacted. So the women are expected to stay at home if the schools are closed. They're expected to deal with any individual physical harm that has come to individuals in the family. They have to treat with that and accessing the healthcare. That is a very real reality. If the water supply and the electricity supply, then the women's unpaid care work, it triples. It is immense. And it therefore makes it very difficult, even if they've been able to maintain their job, to maintain their job. Now, the flip side is, if you have a robust prevention process when it comes to disaster risk reduction, integral to that is both women and men having a voice. Women and men have different cycles during the day, especially in more traditional societies. So there's no way, people ask us all the time during the tsunamis, the tsunami many years ago in
2004.
2004, thank you. Why the numbers showed more women. And that had a lot to do with where women were at the time when the tsunamis hit. That what they were doing at the time in structures that were not secure, that were more because they were home. That is not to say that men don't suffer terribly from disasters. It's just, if we don't have the statistics in hand, it is very difficult to treat with. I understand that in Sri Lanka, a lot of your disaster statistics are at the household level, which is good, but it doesn't drill down into what's actually happening to the individuals based on age or sex,
Right.
and that is crucial. And across the region, we are working more and more on helping governments have better gender-responsive, climate-related data. And that we're finding from Solomon Islands through is really benefiting the countries when they come time, unfortunately, to treat with the disasters that hit. The last lens I would add to is, you cannot ignore the fact that a crucial part of women, peace and security is social cohesion.
Right.
And if the same communities are repeatedly hit by the disasters, and those communities are communities that social cohesion is crucial, that can exacerbate tensions. And so increasingly across the region, UN Women is working with the governments under their Women, Peace and Security Action Plans to recognize disaster risk reduction as foundational to peace and security for communities. And it's an ask we're getting, but it's also something we're able to illustrate when we do it in East Asia or in the Pacific, across South Asia and Southeast Asia, for example. And unfortunately, climate-related disasters are a red thread across all of this vast region.
Unfortunately so. My final question, because we are almost out of time. Your visit this time to Sri Lanka was to assess the work of UN Women in Sri Lanka, especially with government and private sector and the non-governmental organizations and so on. Could you talk a little bit about UN Women and your work here in Sri Lanka?
Certainly. It's been an excellent visit. I was able to meet with our key government counterparts, the Ministry for Women and Children, the Minister herself, the National Commission on Women, and a number of our civil society partners, as well as our development partners and our sister UN agencies. UN Women in the country, we have a large investment on a specific economic model for women, where we help women-owned businesses and women, self-employed women, to have greater access to both financial resources, but to be more competitive, particularly in those sectors where we see significant growth. Undercutting all of this is making sure that these are climate resilient enterprises. But we do this in communities with the community, so that it's also about recognizing leadership in all its forms and the crucial need to break those glass ceilings at the community level. And embedded in that is inherently having safer spaces for girls and boys and women and men. where the fact that you're a girl or a boy doesn't alter the degree of your safety or the type of unsafe experiences you have. And we've been very proud. We've been able to do this through the significant support of the Government of Australia in close partnership with local authorities and with the central government. And the demand is something we are challenged to keep up with. We're reaching hundreds and hundreds of women and thousands of families because of it. We also work a great deal around supporting the government's implementation of the Women, Peace and Security plan that they have. It's one of the only active women, peace and security plans in all of South Asia. And we really commend that the government remains so committed to the issue. And within that is very much a social inclusion, but also making sure that as many diverse groups of women and men are included in that. And then climate intersects so much of what we do. We do a great deal of work with the government in understanding the international commitments and what that can look like in terms of legislative reform. And we are trying to help strengthen statistical analysis as well, so that the government has a clearer picture. You can't make firm policy decisions without the statistics in hand. And these are some of the priorities. And then always, in almost everything we do, is treating with the eradication of gender-based violence. To be clear, the violence against women and girls is the most egregious form of gender inequality. It is part and parcel of the same reason why women are not as employed as men. It is the same root cause, which is how communities, individuals, families value women and men and girls and boys.
Christine Arab, thank you very much for being with me this evening and enlightening our audience on this vast area of human society, and especially in your region, which spans the entire Asia Pacific. Christine Arab is, of course, the Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific at UN Women. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Naresh, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And I'm afraid that's all the time we have this evening. Thank you very much to you at home for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.
Paving paths and changing destinies.